We want to bring in now Fox News contributor and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, thank you for getting up early. If you will, just your reaction to what has transpired and to put into context for us, how significant of an operation, of a moment is this?
Well, good morning. It's a very significant operation. Our military did indeed, as President Trump said, carry out an operation that there's no other country in the world could do. That's been years and years in the making, but the folks who were flying last night were brave and capable and clearly delivered on their mission. And every American should be incredibly proud of that and thankful for them. As for what resulted, the world is safer today. And you were asking earlier, what do the Gulf Arab states think this morning? I am confident that they too are safer. So this was important not only for Israel and for the Gulf Arab states, but to keep the United States of America safe as well. President Trump, I served with him for 4 years. For a decade now, he's been very clear. They're not going to get a nuclear weapon in Iran. And this is just a further manifestation of his commitment to that over a long period of time. And last night, he executed a mission that was righteous and decent and important and will keep us all safer.
Mr. Secretary, you say the world is safer today, and I understand the logic there. But, I think it's reasonable to say that the service members stationed in the Middle East probably aren't safer today. Do you have any prediction on what Iran's retaliation might look like if they would target capabilities as opposed to troops or anything like that?
No, that's a good point. Look, it's always hard to put your own soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines' lives at risk. I remember when we took the Soleimani strike, we were very worried and had done a ton of work to keep folks at Al Assad Air Base and our other facilities in the Middle East safe. I'm confident that the administration has taken those protections as well. Make no mistake about it, the Iranians could come after that, but President Trump has set the course, right? He has said, you're not going to have a nuclear weapon, and if you come after an American, we're going to wreak absolute hell on you. I think the Iranian regime is thinking through that in the same way they did after we took out General Soleimani. While we had some soldiers injured, their response was relatively weak, and they are even in a far weaker place. Their capabilities today are even far weaker than they were when we took that strike back in the first Trump administration. So I suspect they're trying to figure out what to do. I'll be very surprised if they challenge President Trump and the United States Department of Defense.
Well, I hope that you're absolutely right, Mike, because we've been told that the regime is insane and genocidal. So let's hope that they're being rational right now. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that we've had 4 years of an open border. And so we've been talking about what kind of retaliatory attacks they can make in that region. But we've had an open border and a record number of unknown and known terrorists coming across our border over the last 4 years. So what kind of implications does that have for the United States right now in terms of potential sleeper cells and attacks actually here on the homeland?
I've been talking about this risk for 4 years. It's probably even slightly heightened now. There's no doubt the Iranian regime has tried to put active agents on the ground in Europe and Brussels and Paris and London, and indeed here in the United States. And you're absolutely right. We've had a wide open border. We know that at least a couple of hundred folks who were already on the American terror designated watch list who came across the border during the Biden administration. So that risk is not zero. It could be that that'll be a method by which the Iranians will choose to try and take vengeance and respond and to deter the United States. I'm counting on our FBI and local law enforcement to help keep all of us safe, including those who have been threatened directly by the regime itself. But more importantly than that, I think the Iranians' calculus has to be very careful here. They have to understand that while we spared the political leadership and energy infrastructure targets last night, there's no guarantee that that will continue if they come after an American, whether that's one of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines abroad, or someone here in the United States.
And you yourself were famously threatened by the regime as well. I want to get your thoughts on this, because satellite images show lines of trucks leaving the Fordo facility on Thursday, about 48 hours prior to the strike. Are you worried that Iran was able to move out material from Fordo? Again, it's unclear exactly what was in those trucks, but, your instinct says they moved some nuclear material, whatever they could potentially move in those trucks. Are you worried about that?
I think this is going to be something that the U.S. intelligence community and the Israeli intelligence community have to work their way through to figure out what they did to disperse not only those cylinders that held the highly enriched uranium, but their intellectual capital as well, that human capital that drives their program forward, and the components of their ballistic missile system. They'll try to hide them and scatter them. I think that's something that we'll have to stay after. I suspect that in spite of the real success last night, there'll still be work to do to fully eradicate every remnant of their nuclear program. But I think we shouldn't forget that's a massive setback from what President Trump did last night. The change in the nature of the Iranian capability to launch or build a nuclear weapon is now enormously diminished as a result of what the Israelis have done over the last 9 days and what the United States of America did that it only could do last night.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you about this operation, and it's what our colleague here, Jen Griffin, says maybe one of the most remarkable operational security feats pulled off. We, of course, learned from the tracking of B-2s headed to Guam west, but it appears the real package delivered flew east, made this 30-hour round trip, and no one knew about it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, bravo. Well done. Hard to do in Washington, D.C. to keep narratives from leaking, storylines from leaking. The administration did truly, truly good work. I think there was strategic campaign as well of misinformation, right, to move those bombers to Guam. I think, by the way, I think it sent a message to the Chinese Communist Party, too. You might want to stay out of this. But I also think it was an effort when President Trump said, hey, you've got up to 2 weeks. I think he heard from the Iranians they weren't remotely interested in negotiating seriously. And he said, no, we're going to move quickly. We're going to do the necessary. We're going to make sure they don't have this capability. And so I think this was an incredibly strategic operation. And I think both the Russians and the Chinese now understand that President Trump is not President Biden. And not only did we make the world safer in the specific with respect to this Iranian threat, but President Trump has grabbed the peace through strength mantra, the peace through strength model that President Reagan so expertly wielded, and now has kept us all safer from multiple threats, not just the Iranian regime.
Mike, really quick, a question, because you brought up China, and that's something that we're all very concerned about. When Ukraine and the Russians went into war, we saw that China and Russia got closer. So that was sort of one of the repercussions of that war that I felt like wasn't really thought enough about. We had a guest on earlier who said, yes, that this strike and the fact that China didn't come in to help that we know of Iran in this, that this shows that, you know, this proves that China is weaker today because of that. But the other possibility is that China maybe likes this, and seeing us distracted, whether it's in Ukraine or bogged down in another Middle East adventure. Could that be something that concerns you? And what does that mean for the world, and especially for the East, where China is focused a lot more on?
So a couple thoughts here. First, I don't think President Trump's going to permit the United States to get bogged down here. We use this language, I think, with
I hope not. I hope you're right.
Yes,
yeah.
With relative looseness, right? He has made very clear these is a set of limited targets with an objective of eliminating their nuclear program. And I get it. In war, things can happen that you don't expect.
Yeah.
But the Chinese Communist Party would be wholly mistaken if they think this is going to distract us from deterring their aggression, whether that's against the United States or against Taiwan. President Trump will manage through each of these in a way that protects and keeps Americans safe. I'm very confident of that. And we should think, too, the Chinese are the primary purchaser of Iranian crude oil. When we talk about whether they might decide to close the Strait of Hormuz, the most directly and most immediately impacted will be the Chinese economy, not Western economies. And so I think the Chinese picked a loser here. I think Xi Jinping woke up today recognizing that he had picked the loser. And I am not surprised that neither he nor Vladimir Putin in Russia have actually come to the assistance of a nation that they promised they had a deep, forever partnership with. And they have just been no-shows as Iran has been decimated.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a good morning.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.